All right, I'm Jim Angel, chair of the board of the Taub Center, and I have succeeded Helen Abelis recently in that position. So today I'm going to moderate the discussion of the findings and policy implications of the Taub Center's initiative on research into early childhood development and inequality. Early childhood, in this case, I believe is defined as birth to about age 6. This is a research initiative started at the Taub Center in 2019. And in only those 2 years, the center has become a trusted voice, providing evidence-based information and analyses to policymakers. As we just learned and were reminded, this discussion is being recorded and it'll be available later on to share with others. We have 2 speakers this morning. First is going to be Professor John Gall of the Taub Center. John's bio, as well as Yael's, the second speaker, I believe has been distributed in advance, and I think Casey's going to post it in the chat if people want to have another look. John is the chair of the Taub Center Welfare Policy Program. He's also a professor at Hebrew University in Jerusalem, where he is the director of the research program on social welfare policy. Professor Gall recently appeared before the Knesset Special Committee for the Rights of the Child, where he discussed conditions in Arab preschools and daycare centers, which we'll be hearing about shortly. Our second speaker is going to be Dr. Yael Navon, also of the Taub Center. She's a Taub Center researcher and data analyst. She has a BA in economics and philosophy and an MA and PhD in sociology. So we'll be hearing from Yael second. As we go, we're leaving plenty of time for questions at the end of the presentations. Please write them down in the chat so we can catch them and provide them later on. And then just one last reminder, if you haven't already, please mute yourselves during the discussions so we can hear the presentations. And with that, Professor Gall, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Jim, and thank you for the introduction. It's good to see everybody. What we really want to do, as Jim said, is to describe some of the findings of our initiative on early childhood development and inequality. This is an initiative that is being led by Professor Yossi Shavit, who used to head the education team at the Taub Center, but now is leading this early childhood development initiative. Yossi has spent decades studying the link between education and inequality, or how education deals with inequality. And he's been working on this early childhood issue for the last few years and has really done a wonderful job along with his team. The initiative is supported, as you can see, by Yad HaNadiv, by the Bernard Van Leer Foundation and the Bracha Foundation, and we're very grateful for their generous support for this really important initiative. Basically, the initiative is emerged both because of the great amount of international data that we have now on early childhood development and the way it has the impact it has on inequality, or rather the way early childhood development can help us deal with inequality and poverty. A second reason that
we didn't obviously read.
I'm sorry. Could I just remind folks to mute themselves so we can hear?
Okay. Okay, and of course we also think of very much at the Taub Center about policy implications, and here we're really thinking a lot about the idea of social investment. So the idea that welfare states should not only deal with poverty in the present, but also think about how we deal with inequality and poverty in the long term, and ways that we can do this. And I think this issue of early childhood education is really crucial in the way we think about that. So let me just give you 2 very brief aspects of Israeli society that I think are relevant to this discussion. The first, of course, is, and I suppose most of you know this, that the proportion of children in Israel is very, very high, certainly compared to other welfare states. In fact, the proportion of children from birth to the age of 4 infants in Israel is nearly double that at the mean level of the mean proportion in other welfare states. So basically, we have a lot of children, which is great, of course. We have a lot of infants, and but this also creates challenges for our welfare state, for our social welfare system. The second fact that I want to share with you, which I think is very relevant to our discussion, is of course the poverty levels in our society. The poverty levels in Israel are very high. We have about a fifth of our population live below the poverty line. And as you can see, compared to other welfare states, this is particularly high, comparable, I suppose, to the United States and other less developed welfare states. So that's a really big issue and a big challenge, both for policymakers in Israel and of course for the Taub Center, which focuses on social policy. Not only do we have a large proportion of individuals and families below the poverty line, but we also have a very large proportion of children below the poverty line. So nearly a third of all children in Israel live in poor families. And of course, this has major implications, not only for the present, but also for the future. What is, I think, particularly important to our discussion today is that as you can see, about nearly 60% of all Arab children and Haredi children live in poor families. So we have a very, very large proportion of children who have very limited access to some of the important, important things that children need to be able to develop their capabilities and really to be able to become citizens of society who are able to escape poverty and contribute to the rest of society. And I think these two ideas, the fact that we have many children and of course many children living in poverty, really underpins our interest in thinking about early childhood development and how we can have an impact on the high levels of poverty and inequality by looking at early childhood development. Gail, do you want to describe a bit about the initiative?
So thank you, Johnny. As we heard, the Israel context means many young children, as Johnny said, and high poverty rates. We also know at the same time from the general literature that the early years of life are critical for development and for future outcomes. And we also know that cognitive gaps by socioeconomic profiles already appear at infancy. So therefore, the objectives of the initiative are to study environmental factors in early childhood that correlate with future outcomes. And of course, we focus on the Israeli context as we wish to affect Israeli policy. And these environmental factors are located in many facets. They're located at homes, at early childhood and care frameworks, and within the community. So we wish to use our findings as well as universal knowledge to advance policy that may reduce inequalities in Israel. We can say that our task is to help policymakers to design research-based policy, which is, of course, the mission of the Taub Center at large. I would like to dive a bit deeper into two of these areas of early childhood environment. So the first one was the home. Here, again, we said that there are many kids growing up in Israel in poverty, and this may affect their later life outcomes. What we see here is the average standardized test scores by quintiles of income per capita. And this is for the youngest ages, birth to in the first 2 years of life. So here in the red circle, Casey, can you show the red circles? Yeah, this is the average for the lowest quintile, which is significantly lower than the other quintiles, as you can see, which are on the right side. We see here in this chart math scores at 5th grade, but this finding was also exactly the same or similar in a different subject, as well as in 8th grade, so 8th grade tests. So what we learn here is that economic circumstances in their very early childhood, birth to 2, affect achievement in adolescence. Another home environment factor we studied, which I don't show here, is parental stress. But I'll just say that for now we found, as we were expecting, that it affects parenting, and we assume that parenting, of course, affects young children development. So we talked about the home, and the second arena we were focusing on is education and care centers. You should know the kids in Israel spend a lot of time in early childhood frameworks. The participation rates are very high in Israel compared to OECD. You can see here that among children ages 3 to 5, there's almost universal participation in frameworks. So this is not the case when looking at earlier ages, but still comparatively high, even for younger children. And this matters, or actually this is good. We think this is good because we know both from the literature as well as from our study that children who spend more time in early childhood centers have better academic outcomes. This is a chart from our study on Pearl Score, which is a test addressing reading achievement at 4th grade. We see here that children who spend 4 years or more in early education frameworks have higher scores in compared to those who spend less time in these frameworks. So that is going on even when controlling for other factors. That's what we see here. And on the left-hand side, we see, Casey? On the left-hand side, we see that, that it is particularly substantial for children whose mother have no higher education. So you see below the average for children who spend 3 years or less, and above it, the average for children who spend 4 years or more in frameworks. So the lower socioeconomic strata children benefit more from longer participation, but then we also know that they are less likely to spend a lot of time in early childhood centers. Casey? Thanks, sorry. So as we say, at ages younger than 3, participation is also high in Israel compared to OECD, but it is not universal. And maybe more important, participation from birth to age 3 is not equally distributed between children of a different socioeconomic background. We can see here that these children of mother with no higher education, which we saw that were more affected by duration of early childhood frameworks, tend to spend less time in these frameworks. You see that it descends with the share of children at home with parents or family members descends with mother education from 81% to 27%. And this pattern works also when we look at participation by income categories. Now, participation is also lower among Arabs, and Johnny will tell you more about this.
Okay, so let me talk a bit about what we think is a major problem and present some of the research that we've done recently and which will be published, in fact, next week. If we assume that participation in early childhood education is important for the future development of young children, and in particular, if we think that it's important that young children go to supervised, subsidized early childhood education, which exists in Israel, and the government does subsidize and does supervise, then I think we can assume that that this would be particularly important for children who live in poor families, and of course many children in poor families are in the Arab sector. So what we really would want to see is that as many Arab children as possible, infants, get to early childhood education, supervised early education. But what our research shows is that, in fact, when we compare different groups in Israeli society, we see that within the Arab sector, there's a very, very low percentage of participation of infants in supervised early childhood frameworks or daycare centers. Only about 18%, which is basically 80% or more than 80% of Arab children or Arab infants do not participate, do not go to supervised early childhood frameworks. So what our research really was trying to find out was, why is this the case? Why do we see that a large proportion of Jewish and Haredi kids go to supervised early childhood education frameworks, but not Arab children? What our research showed, there are really 4 different reasons that can explain why this is the case. One reason, of course, is parental choice. So in some cases, parents may think that it's best if the child stays at home, particularly young children, if they stay at home or they're looked after by relatives or other members of the family. But we think there are other reasons as well, and this is what emerged from our research. What we saw was that there are what we call systematic barriers to Arab infants participating in supervised early childhood. What we saw is that in many cases, the number of early childhood frameworks in Arab localities is much smaller than that in Jewish localities. And we also saw that the Arab localities find it very difficult to actually utilize or take up the funding that the government offers to try to help them establish these early childhood frameworks. There are different reasons for this. Part of them are related to the problems in planning within local Arab localities. Some are related to the lack of resources that Arab localities have, which create major problems for them to try to fund or add additional funding to establish these early childhood frameworks. But the result is that even if parents want to send their kids to early childhood frameworks in the Arab sector, that may be very difficult for them to do. There are also what we call barriers that affect access. So Arab mothers or fathers who want to send their children to early childhood frameworks may not only find that there are very few childhood frameworks, childcare centers in their locality, but transportation difficulties will prevent them from getting their children there and getting them and going to work. Also, because these access to these frameworks is dependent on the mother working, in the Arab sector, only a relatively small, or about 40% of mothers work. So if the mothers don't work, the children won't be accepted into supervised early childhood frameworks. There are also other access issues regarding language and the bureaucratic barriers, but all what we see is that access is a major problem that prevents Arab children, Arab infants, from participating in supervised early childhood frameworks. And finally, we looked at issues of funding and cost, and what we saw was that the financial burden was particularly high within the Arab sector if parents want to send their children to supervised early childhood frameworks, because of the very low wages that Arab women have and the options that they have to send them to very cheap early childhood frameworks, which are not supervised, so generally the standard is very low. Because of the costs and because of the options that they have, we think that there is very little incentive for Arab parents to send their children to early childhood frameworks. The result is, of course, that children do not get the access to the good high-level early childhood education that they need in order to be successful in their education and in their later life. Okay, so I'll move on back to the Yael.
Thanks, Johnny. So we talked about the home environment, which include poverty and stress. We talked about participation rates and its importance, and about access. But there's yet another challenge in Israel, which is what is actually happening in the frameworks. Compared to other countries, the quality of Israeli centers could be considered low. So for instance, you can see in this diagram that the children to staff ratio is high in Israel. You can see Israel on the left upper side, and you can see there are many children, around 30, and not that many staff members. And we also know that around half of the staff in the Israeli preschool are teaching assistants. These are not required to any educational standards. So in fact, 70% of the assistants have at best a high school education. And of course, as Johnny already said, until this year, only about a quarter of the children ages birth to 3 has been in supervised centers. Of course, this is not close to the share of children in any education and care setting. So, as we said, that the participation rate is high as well in this age group. So we know almost nothing on the environment, in which a great share of young Israeli children spent about 8 hours a day. Having said this, the situation is starting to change. We're glad to say that the situation is starting to change. This year, the government has started to implement a supervision law. This means that all frameworks of more than 7 kids have to meet the legal standards, and it also means, it doesn't mean that, but all these frameworks, which were under the Ministry of Labor, Social Affairs and Social Services, are now being transferred in 2 months to the Ministry of Education. So it would be very interesting to see what kind of impact these changes entail. So this is giving you a view of some of our findings to date. I also want to share with you what we do in order to be able to do quality research going forward. So we devoted tremendous time and effort to bring together data on almost 3 million Israelis born between 1985 and 2005. We did it through the Central Bureau of Statistics, and we were preparing this data for analysis and new studies. This comprehensive data set pulls data from many different administrative sources, including demography, birth information, family income, place of residence, and so on. And it connects it with those individual scholar outcomes, and with income at early 30s, and with some information on criminal records. The investment in this database is one of our major projects, as this is a dynamic data set that's supposed to keep on giving. We should be able to connect and explore more life course outcomes as these individuals grow older. And some of our, or most of our ongoing research is based on this data set. But as I said in the beginning, our task is not only to enhance knowledge. Our purpose is to affect policy in light of this knowledge. And this is a large part of the initiative task, to keep early childhood in the agenda of a policymaker, of the media, and the public. So to achieve that, we have to engage the public and policymakers. And I want to tell you a little bit about our dissemination. It was mentioned already by Jim that the finding Johnny presented today were presented last month in the Knesset Special Committee for the Rights of the Child. Overall, the team has held 46 meetings with policymakers and with other stakeholders on early childhood. And team members also served as advisor in government committees and for organization working in the field. For example, the chair of the initiative, Professor Yossi Shavit, served on the Ministry of Education Chief Scientist Committee. So we meet with policymakers and other stakeholders to share our findings. We also meet with whoever can help us to improve and to advance data collection, information collection. For instance, we met with OECD staff regarding to their international early childhood study. And this week, we have a follow-up meeting with the relevant officials in Israel. We held a training seminar for early childhood professionals last year, which was a great success, and we're conducting it again this year. We published op-eds in leading newspapers. The initiative also hosted the Taub Center first ever early childhood conference, which was called Early Childhood Education in Israel, the Corona and Back. And we intend to host another conference this year. We also produced a short video and a podcast to convey some of our findings in an easily accessible format. And all of these with the goal of informing the public discourse and helping to shape the conversation about early childhood in Israel. So to sum, I want to say that we do already see in the last few years changes in the discourse and in practice, but there is still a lot of work. And we think that one of the most important steps of this stage is advancing data collection. We are trying to contribute to this purpose to make it available to the whole research community. And I want to thank you for listening and for being with us here today. And I hope to be able to update you again soon with some new findings and some good news for our children in light of the policy changes ongoing. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over back to Jim and to take your questions. Thank you.
All righty. Thank you, John and Yael. I thought that was fascinating, a bit sobering to think that there's this tremendously important resource available, but that it's being underutilized. That concludes the main part of the program. We now have a bunch of time for questions. If people need to leave, thank you for being here, and we can distribute the recording of the conversation later on. But in the meantime, if people would either throw questions into the chat or raise their hands. I apologize because I can't see too many people at once. Although I do see Mark's hand up. So let's start with Mark.
Thank you, Jim. I wanted to ask a couple of questions. Two was, one is the government of Israel, is this a high priority for the government? You did talk about lobbying them and talking and working with them on different initiatives, but is this a strong priority for the GOI, and yet some in the Arab community many in the Arab community just don't want to take advantage of it or express no interest? And also, is that true in the Haredi community as well, where the government wants preschool education, yet the Haredi community are resistant? And it leads to the question of how many people send their children to preschool that's religious in nature versus more secular in nature. Could you answer that question for me? Anybody?
Fine. I'll start, Yael. Okay, is that all right? Okay, so thanks for the questions. They're right to the point. Well, let me begin by saying, yes, this is a government priority, and it has been for the last decade. It began after the really large demonstrations in 2011. One of the major issues then was early childhood education. And ever since, the government has been spending a lot more money on early childhood education and effort to make it better. So yes, it is a priority. And in fact, in the current budget, which was just passed last week, quite a significant amount of resources will be devoted to early childhood education in the Arab sector. So that's the answer to the first question. The second question is, or the second comment, I wouldn't characterize what is happening amongst Arabs as parents not wanting to send their kids to early childhood education. I think parents in most cases would like to send their kids to good quality early childhood education. The problem is that they don't have access to that sort of education in their locality, either because there isn't early childhood education, or because there are obstacles to get their kids there, or because they just don't have enough money to pay for the early childhood education. Now send their kids to something that is a lot cheaper. So that's the way I see it. Early childhood education in Israel is provided by non-profits, basically, not by the government. The government subsidizes very often, or by local authorities. In fact, Haredim send a very high proportion, or relatively high proportion, of their young children and their infants to early childhood education. But these are religious early childhood education frameworks or childcare. And in the same way that education in the Haredi community is defined by the Haredim, the same is true for early childhood education. So for them, this is part of their educational system. And in fact, they do it much better, or at least they take up it much better than other communities in Israeli society.
Thank you.
I see Ariel's hand up. You want to go
Actually,
next?
Mark, let me add one little thing to what Johnny just said. In the recent elections, in the discussions of the budget, in the budget that just came up, there was a very large issue of one of the things that they wanted to do was to change the early childhood financing so that people who both members of the couple, both the husband and wife, are not working, would not be able to get assistance by the government, even if their income was low. And this was to a very large extent seen as, in particular, harming the Haredi population, because they would be the ones who when the husband is learning instead of being in a job, they would no longer be able to receive that benefit. So they are actually do have, like Johnny said, a very large percentage were actually in these frameworks, but this was a whole issue that came up over the past few months.
Thank you.
Just wanted to react to Mark's question. My name is Ariel Levy, and I'm the CEO of Ashalim, JDC Israel. Just want to add to Mark's question is that the investment per child in Israel in early childhood systems is around $5,200, or maybe a bit more in the last 2 years, because it's not very updated detail. And the average in the OECD is more than double. So in terms of proportion to the OECD, it's not very good, but still, I can say from my last job in the government, it's much more in upfront in terms of proportions and a lot of investment, especially in the Arab system, etc. in the last few years. I think since Shai Piron as a minister and Bennett, they understand that early childhood is important. It's not something, it's like schooling in the front and early childhood is behind. I think the pyramid is about changing in the last few years. And the second thing is a comment. Just first of all, I want to thank you about these details. It was very interesting. And Yael and Johnny, and I wanted to know if actually you use the Lamas in order to do the additional research because we actually investigating the same things, and we would like maybe to get help with those details about how to predict the social mobility of childs. That's what all Ashalim is about. In order to predict, we need that kind of information in early childhood, and we believe that early childhood, just believe, we know from research and practice that investing in early childhood is giving a lot of effect in later on, and we need those details. It will be very helpful. And last thing is, we just initiate a week ago an ROI research with SFI about social investment in early childhood is actually bringing back every shekels, another 5 shekels for the system in terms of income and preventing things. So investing in early childhood is not just a good thing from social mobility perspective from the individual, it's very good for economics too.
Very interesting.
Yael, do you want to respond about research, the data?
Yeah, of course. The data, of course, of the Central Bureau of Statistics, we merge a lot of their files. And now we have a file kind of following up children who were born in 1985 till 2005. So children who were born in 2005, we can't really know what happened to them, like about mobility, okay, because they're still 15 years old or something like that. But we can know something about children who were born in the 80s, in the late 80s, or in the beginning of the 90s. And as I said, we see this is a dynamic database. So we intend to keep on asking for more details on these individuals to know better about their future. So that's exactly what we're doing.
I'll just add, hi, I'm Susie. I'm the Director General of the Taub Center. And I just want to add that part of our mission in this whole project is both to, in terms of in everything we do, but in particular with early childhood, is not just to have an impact on the work that the government is doing, but also to share our research in order to have an influence on the work that going on in civil society. And of course, more than anything, we're part of the joint family, and to have and to share our findings with you at Ashalim is of course critical and important to us. So absolutely, it's an important partnership.
Actually, Ariel, I want to add one thing also. Actually, comes straight out of what Johnny said and you said together. Johnny pointed out that we have twice as many children as they have in the OECD. You pointed out that we spend half as much per child. Do the multiplication, you'll come out to the same basic numbers. It's not exact, of course.
I'm not sure that's the reason for that, but maybe.
But it's part of the. I'm not saying that's the only reason for it, yeah. but it's part of the reason.
Yeah, of course.
Interesting point, Avi. Thanks.
I think the comparative number, by the way, in the U.S. I read recently is $500, which is pretty painful. Keep coming with the questions. I've got a question in the meantime. I'm particularly interested in the structural barriers. And this is a question for both John and Yael, I think. What would it take to bring down some of those structural barriers? Is that a matter of legislation, changes in the financing? And this gets, of course, to what the policy implications are. But in terms of what the particular barriers are, what would it take to help remedy them?
Well, we looked at that with regard to the Arab sector, because this is what our research was about, and we talked to both people on the local level and in civil society organizations and in the government. And the issue within the Arab sector is that really the Arab localities are very different from Jewish localities in the sense of the resources they have, normally poor communities. So they have limited resources to actually, for example, to help equip early childhood centers. They also have less the capacity to actually utilize government funding. So even if the government does want to fund them, they need to be able to deal with planning issues, with issues of bureaucracy. And these are very, very difficult issues or barriers within the Arab sector. And a third issue, which I think is very important, is that within the Arab sector, at least, land is a big issue. And the problem is that very often there's just not enough land to build early childhood centers. And one of our recommendations, or one of the policy options we discussed in our research, was trying to think about ways of dealing specifically with the needs of the Arab localities, which are, as I said, different from those of Jewish localities, to try to make the regulations, the laws, the funding mechanisms, the planning mechanisms appropriate or relevant specifically to the Arab localities if we really want them to utilize the funding that we have and get their kids into supervised early childhood centers.
Are there surveys that are taken of the Arab community for priorities that they feel are important in their own community? And where does, if there is, where does early childhood education fall in for priorities in the Arab family and community?
There are no surveys of that kind. What we did use was surveys based on interviews with the heads of Arab localities, where they tried. The survey was basically tried to understand what are the barriers that prevent them from increasing supervised early childhood education within their communities. There was also a survey that the Taub Center did 2 or 3 months ago, and the survey included a large proportion of the Arab population, Arab parents to young children, and we asked questions on those issues. And what emerged from that, at the very least, was that this wasn't an issue of personal preferences. In other words, the parents didn't say they don't want to send their kids to early childhood education, but they described the sort of obstacles that prevent them from doing so. So our sense is that our sense is at least that I think there is a need and there is a desire within the Arab community to have good early childhood education, which is accessible, but there are many barriers that prevent this from actually happening.
It's got a sad future. The outcomes that we'll be looking at in Israel 30 years from now and over time, and we already have problematic current issues, and it doesn't seem that it's going to get much better over the working lifetime of an adult.
But at least with regard to the Arab community, and we can talk about Haredim also, but with regard to the Arab community, both previous government and particularly this government are really spending making a very big effort to try to integrate Arabs better into the economy, into the labor market, both because I think people understand that this is an issue that is bad for society and bad for individuals, but also because it's very clear that if we don't get young, smart Arab kids into good schooling, into universities, and into the labor market, we're not going to have enough people in the labor market to have this thriving high-tech sector in Israeli society.
Maybe one word of hope, Mark. In the new resolution of the government concerning the Arab society, they put a lot of money, as Johnny just described, in education, in early childhood. And Ashalim has a line there, in a way. We still need to finalize that and to help and try to deal with few of the obstacles, not all of them, concerning early childhood in the Arab society. Probably we're not going to deal with the land and, building places, but we can work, for example, about the capacity that's working there and other obstacles concerning early childhood. And again, we need to divide birth to 3 system and 3 to 6, because I think there are a lot of differences between the 2 systems today that's unifying in January under the Ministry of Education, but still different numbers, different rates of participation. It's totally different systems.
Thank you.
And Ariel, well, there should be different rates of participation. For instance, from what Yael was presenting before, the return you get on ages 0 to 2 is not at all similar to what you get for a little bit older ages. It's not clear that you necessarily want your half-year-old not at home. Because there are benefits and costs to everything. So therefore, having them different from each other makes a lot of sense in many ways.
Well, one issue that, of course, we didn't talk about, but which is, of course, employment to get mothers into the labor market. And of course, one of the one of the reasons that this early childhood education system was originally established in Israel was, of course, to enable mothers mainly for young kids to be able to get into work and not be at home with their children and never really develop a career in the labor market. So this is also part of the whole story when we think about early childhood education.
Yeah, but still, Avi, you know that we have 2,200 daycares in Israel. Only 122 of them are in Arabs. So still, we don't have accessibility as the researchers described, but yet it's controversial whether 1 year old should go to systems or not. But still, we're talking about other different systems of education or educare in that times, right?
Absolutely. The research that Johnny just did together with two other researchers, Labib Shami and Shavit Madhala, goes very deeply into exactly what's going on and why that's happening, and also give a whole list of possible ways to try to address these different issues. And you've only heard a little bit of it from what Johnny presented here, but there's a lot more inside the study, which any of you who find this very interesting, I highly recommend that you read it.
It'll be coming out next week.
It'll be coming out next week, available to anybody who wants it.
We're going to send it to folks, even if you don't. I see Linda's hand up. Do you want to go ahead, Linda?
Yeah, thank you. This is a great presentation. Again, Mark, you've raised great issues. My brain was going. These are cultural differences. There are cultural barriers. Every culture prioritizes differently. And so there's usually a clash between government and cultures. So there's a lot of stuff there for us to think about when we, from Western society, see things one way, and we want to get others from different cultural backgrounds to assimilate. So there may be a clash in priorities, and the one main question that I have is, are there, in order to put things in place for these different cultural societies, you would need to train professionals within that cultural society. So have you addressed that? Would you address that? I mean, everything takes time. Everything's a building block. So has this been addressed? In order to implement something, you need to have that as well. And people from those cultures then need to see the need. Well, this is an employment for me as well. And then who will train them based on their cultural way of living?
I think this is the issue of trained professionals or professionals in the field of education, at least within the Arab society in Israel, is, I think, less of an issue. I think there is training. You know, we have, of course, a separate educational system for the Arab society, and it's in Arabic, of course, and teaching is by Israeli Arabs. And I don't think there's a lack of professionals, Arab professionals or Arab teachers or kindergarten teachers. That is not the issue. The question is, of course, if they have somewhere to actually be to teach. So they need these places, these frameworks, to be able to work with the children. I think that's less of an issue, but of course, culture is something that we have to think about a lot when we're talking about education, in early childhood education, of course, and also when we think about to what degree do parents want to send their kids to, to early childhood education, or do they prefer to keep them at home? But the findings from our research show that the issue is less that they want to keep them at home and more that they want to send them. But the question is, where do they send them to?
Great. I have one other question about, can someone say a word before we go about what's next for the for this initiative at the Taub Center? What research do you guys have upcoming?
Yeah. So as I said, most of our ongoing research is based on the data set that we have in the CBS, in the data set of the cohorts of 1995 to 2005. And we're looking at the early years and what's going on at homes. So we're looking at incomes for each year and in utero, and we're looking at labor force participation of parents as factors that may contribute to future outcomes of children. And we're also looking at family formation. So that's what we're doing now, but we hope to get better data. I mean, we work very hard, and that's what I think I said at the end of the presentation. We work very hard to get more data and to get the government to spend money on information, because we can't really know. We don't go into the frameworks. We don't know much about their quality. We don't know where these children are going. Actually, 75% of the children which are not going to the supervised centers, we have no idea where they're going, and we don't have any developmental information. So we spend a lot of time and a lot of effort to convince that we need to have more information and more data collected in Israel. And I think this is
What Yael is talking about, we've actually been working on for a number of years to try to get a specific database from a specific group, and it seems like hopefully we're closing in on it. So, so then Yael's going to have a lot of work to do.
Well, I want to thank you all for joining in. It's been a great discussion, nice participation by everyone. It's quite an informative discussion. Thanks especially to Professor John Gall and Dr. Yael Navon. To those of you who joined in today, thank you so much for making the time. We're going to send links to each of you with links to the research updates from the Taub Center and links to the publications that we talked about today. And with that, I just want to say take care, stay safe, and I hope to see you all again soon next time.